So this is our panel today, but we actually have a very special guest who also is not even actually on this sheet here, but she'll get a chance to introduce herself in just a second. Just want to mention that both Brandon and I work at Loyola Marymount University, which is a liberal arts institution in Los Angeles, California. So our examples will be primarily from our institution. We are trying to demonstrate to you the idea of a broad concept of what a gap year is or could be. Okay? So, I've introduced myself. We'll go ahead and let our panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Satna. I work with Mayo College in Edgewater. For those of you who are not familiar, this is a 144-year-old institution. It's a fully residential school with just 700 to 750 students. There are two schools. I work with the boys' school, so this is primarily only a boys' school from grade 4th to 12th.
Good morning. My name is Brandon Grimmett, and I serve as the Associate Provost for Career and Professional Development at Loyola Marymount University. I don't work in recruitment or admission, and so I'm a little bit of an oddball at this event, but I do oversee career development for the university. And so our office is responsible for helping students as soon as their first year of undergraduate, all the way through master's and doctoral students land internships, jobs, graduate school, post-grad service. And so I'll be talking a little bit today about what our students do after they graduate in terms of gap year experiences.
Hi, I'm Annie Prasanna. I'm the college counselor at the American School of Bombay. Previously, I've worked at two different Indian schools that are international, the Dhirubhai Ambani School for 5 years, and before that, a boarding school based in Bangalore, Indus Bangalore. So I've worked with students who are exploring gap year options as part of a post-secondary plan. In all three contexts. So I'll be happy to share the stories that I've had. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me okay? Is that correct? Okay. So first of all, we just want to talk about, in the next hour or so, give you a sense of what a gap year is and what a gap year is not. Talking a little bit about statistics, primarily in the United States, about the prevalence of gap years. Also talk about specific, Sethman actually has some phenomenal data that's actually obtained from Indian counselors about their perspectives about gap years. Of course, Annie has some phenomenal stories as well. And then Brandon has an opportunity to talk about the types of career and professional outcomes that can occur because of these kind of gap year experiences. Okay? So, first of all, what is a gap year? So we're going to talk about gap years roughly in two different contexts. Essentially, we're considering a gap year to be an experience where a student finishes secondary school, and then that student decides to not immediately enroll at a university. Okay? So that's different from a leave of absence, for example, which is where a student would already be at the university and then decide to leave for an unspecified amount of time. Okay? Not really focusing on that. It's also different from a student who chooses simply not to attend a college or university, who simply finishes their secondary school career and then goes on to a work experience. The idea is that these are students who are making a conscious decision after they finish their secondary school year, their secondary school diploma, to spend some time away from a traditional academic setting. Okay? So, it is important to keep in mind that from the United States context, that gap year, and we'll talk about what gap year experiences might be in just a second, but in the United States context specifically, it's very common for students during their gap year to have some kind of overseas experience. Okay? So this tradition actually started primarily in the UK. It was kind of this concept of the grand year, grand tour, and the idea was that a person would pass into adulthood and then take that year to really explore the world and broaden their horizons. That's the general concept of a gap year. So, it is something that is certainly growing in terms of the context of the United States specifically. There are, according to the National Public Radio in the United States, 40,000 students in the United States take a gap year, specifically in 2017. It was certainly something that was being more and more prominent when Malala Obama, the daughter of former President Barack Obama of the United States, decided to take a gap year before entering Harvard. And so that certainly brought a lot of attention to students as well. But it's something that is continuing to grow in terms of a viable option for students to consider, again, before they start their university experience. The other thing to keep in mind as well is, again, these are not students who decide to leave the academic experience and never return, for the most part. As you can see, only about 10% of students decide after their gap year experience not to enroll at a college or university. So again, these are genuinely students who are looking for a year or so to have a different kind of experience outside the academic context with the expressed consideration to return at a future date. So, another thing to keep in mind too is depending upon the experience as well, this is something that can be seen by gap year participants to be an incredibly enriching experience for them. So again, and we'll talk about the incredible diversity of types of things that students can do, but in most cases, students are very positive, have very positive experiences during the time that they take their gap year. I know this is very, very small, so I'll read some of these things to you, but these are some of the factors that may include motivations for why taking a gap year. So the largest ones include wanting to gain experience, personal growth, wanting to travel, see the world, other cultures, wanting a break from academic track, wanting to explore academic pursuits. So here in the Indian context, for example, that can include students who are planning to enhance their own credentials to be able to apply to a college or university by not attending a formal school for that year. But in this particular context, and this is primarily the U.S. context, you can see there's a lot of different motivations for why a student may choose to take a gap year experience. Okay? So, the other thing to keep in mind as well is students often think about this in terms of the personal growth that they can achieve during the course of this year. So the motivations could include things where a student says, there's too much pressure in the academic environment for me. I need some time away. It can be the type of situation where a student may express anxiety about their next steps. And so they really want to take some time, again, away from the academic context, to really consider exactly what the possibilities could be for them in the future. Also, depending upon the type of experience a student may have, it could be someone who's just purely looking for experience outside their traditional context. Wants to explore other countries, other cultures, other experiences. Okay? Again, and what Brandon will talk a lot more significantly about the professional experiences that could be possible, and also at some level the sense of just needing a break. Right? I think all of us have those moments, right? We just need to step away, just need a different context, a different experience to kind of hopefully recharge our batteries. There's that kind of context as well in terms of the motivations. So what are we exactly talking about? Again, it can be any number of different possibilities, literally a number of different providers that offer experiences that could be considered for the gap year. Okay? Anything from learning a second language. In some cases, a gap year might actually be part of a national requirement of military service, for example. So in Singapore would be a good example. Students who are required to do national service, many students will choose to do that right after they finish their secondary school. There are some opportunities that include service experiences. So going and spending a year and doing some kind of social service and getting that kind of experience as well. Maybe a student might be interested in a specific skill set that they have not been able to explore in the academic context. So they want to learn more about filmmaking, or they want to learn more about a specific industry, or something like that. So the idea again is that there's a variety of opportunities. So really, there's not a specific type of experience that would constitute a gap year. And again, you hear more about what types of things students are looking into in just a minute. You have to keep in mind from the university context, again, I'm primarily speaking from my experience at an institution in the United States, but I understand this to be true in a lot of other institutions around the world. If a student is seriously considering a gap year, the best way for that student to consider what the gap year experience is to apply when they would be applying with the rest of the cohort. So apply while they're still in the midst of the academic process to a college university. Okay? Then that college university, again, it's going to vary from place to place, may be open to a deferral. There are some institutions that actually have specific gap year programs that strongly encourage students to consider a gap year. But it's important to keep in mind that if a student you have is seriously considering a gap year, they should look in much more detail into exactly what that institution's policy will be. Okay? A lot of cases as well, a student is expected to make some kind of commitment to the university that they are planning to attend after their gap year. So to LMU specifically, we ask the students to submit a commitment deposit before they are approved for a gap year. And again, depending upon the program they're interested in. So for example, one of our most prominent programs is a film and television production major. We do not offer students the opportunity to defer that particular program because of how competitive the application process for that specific major is. Again, it's going to vary from place to place, But again, in the typical context, we strongly encourage students to think about applying while they're in the midst of that academic context. Now, obviously, if the student's planning to take the year to improve his or her academic credentials, that would be not the case. But if a student's going to go to, say, a year of service in Nepal, for example, then the time to apply would really be while they're still in the midst of their high school experience. Okay. Again, depending upon the university, the policies may vary. So it's important for you to explore with the university whether a gap year is even possible, whether a referral would be possible, or whether a student would be applying completely after the gap year experience. In that case, the university may be very interested and intrigued by the gap year experience, depending on what they have been. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that deferrals definitely, generally speaking, from a university context, are not indefinite. So at LMU specifically, we're comfortable with deferring a student in the right program for a year, depending upon the circumstances, up to 2 years. But again, for a student who's just going to say, at some point, I'm planning on coming back, that's not going to work for us. Right? We need to reserve a spot for that student. We want more of a definite understanding of when they're planning to attend. Okay? So, again, what we're talking about is the experience, and Brandon will talk more about the experience after a university before starting a career, or an experience right after secondary school before starting university. But what we're not discussing is the idea of taking time out in the middle of the university degree. Okay? So, with that being said, Stephanie has some great data about the Indian context as well. Sorry. Oh, please, that's fine.
Hi, good morning. So what I will share with you today is when this topic came to me, I thought why not go and ask the Indian counselors what they think and how much do they advise for gap year and what are their perceptions for gap year. Because frankly, it is not a concept that is native to us. We do not think about it in the usual context. And very few schools first have career counselors, and even fewer would actually advise for gap years or have counseling offices that would advise for gap years. So I ran this little survey, and 42 career counselors, most of them practicing in school settings, got back on the survey. And what I'm going to be sharing with you is data that came out of those survey answers that we got. So the first thing is that approximately, so if you look at this particular slide, which is saying in your career, how many students have you advised to take a gap year? What's evident is that 20% career counselors, and these are career counselors specifically, have never advised a gap year student in their entire career. And approximately 60% counselors have advised less than 5 students for a gap year in their careers. And many of these have practiced for almost 10 years or more. So over long careers, also career counselors have not really advised for gap years. The next slide is, So then what I wanted to understand was that does gap year advice have something to do with the counselor's experience, the years of experience that a counselor has? And yes, sure enough, it does seem to have some association, but it's not as stark as one would imagine. So even counselors who have had, say, 10 years of experience, 20% counselors have not advised for gap year. Of this group, 25% counselors were those who had more than 10 years of experience. So it's not something that only counselors with relatively who are newer to the field don't feel confident or don't feel sure enough to advise. It's even counselors with many years of experience who do not feel that confidence. The next thing then we explored, so this is just a cheeky thing. So are we, is it like a denial thing? Because when we come to conferences and when we discuss, all of us in theory seem to believe that yes, gap years are good and more and more children should be looking at it. But when we go back and when we practice in our own offices, why is it not showing in our practice? So, yeah. And then the next set of questions I had was about the reasons. So I have 2 slides. The first one explains the reasons that students give to the counselor for taking a gap year. And in this, it's nothing surprising. For most students, academic unpreparedness, that they feel that they're academically not prepared is a primary reason for going for a gap year. in this, I found, which I had not expected, I had not thought about it, was to prepare for the IIT or the CLAT. So a lot of kids are taking gap years primarily because they want to take exams. And the second biggest reason was that they were feeling underprepared to make an application. So if you club these 2 points together, the primary reason seems to be that there is not enough preparation work happening at the school level, because of which children are taking a gap year. I would imagine from our conversations that if we were doing a lot of preparation work inside the school, then they would be taking a gap year, because they were very prepared and they were very well, they felt confident that this is what we want to do and that is why we're taking a gap year. It seems to be the other way around. The next one, where we're talking about what we as counselors consider valid reason for taking a gap year. And here, yes, the top reason comes out to be to follow a passion. But it doesn't show through in our students' reasons. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out. Again, feeling academically unprepared and feeling underprepared still are the primary reasons. And which again points to the point that maybe we are not working enough inside the school setup. Right? I just want to see if there's anything I've missed out. Yeah, that's it. This was a very interesting question too. Where I asked counselors, how do they think gap years affect a student's chance of getting into a desired college? And while you see the blue bar which says that improves chances, about 50% counselors felt that gap years usually or always improve a student's chance of getting a desired admission, but there were also almost 48% who believe that they actually create challenges. So a gap year is actually maybe creating a challenge, and or that's perceived in an admission later into a desired college. So that I thought kind of is telling. Then what is the challenge that they think it creates? How do you tell a university that you spent the gap year well? So how do you justify your gap year? That's one challenge. A lot of us felt that there was going to be more competition next year, and so would our child then, be competitive enough? Losing focus, and I thought that's an interesting point, because that's what I hear in my office a lot, which is that because our school system is so structured and tailored, and we kind of almost believe that our children are not capable of taking any decisions. So when we leave them to a gap year, which is largely unstructured, and where we don't have control over how they're spending their time, we worry that they will lose focus. So instead of thinking that they will become more responsible, we are almost certain that they are likely to lose focus, and that's what we perceive as a challenge. And that parents only 3 counselors got back saying that parents are a problem, are the biggest challenge. But whenever we have gap year discussions, we kind of say that parents are one of the biggest challenge. But I think all of us also subscribe to similar fears as parents. Parents also have the same fears, and we subscribe to the same fears too. And yeah, we're done. Thank you.
You want her to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, maybe I should issue a fair warning. I was roped into this presentation last night. I had like 2 glasses of orange juice. And so, yeah, but I'll be happy to share my experiences. So I've worked both. So sometimes the discussion for a gap year emerges organically. When I say that, it means, what I mean by that is a child feels that, yes, as Sapna very rightly said, you might have students, like I've had students, for example, who felt they've been caught in the whole academic cycle and it's intense. And sometimes they need time to pause and reflect. And so if that's the case, and reflection is good, right? It's what you do in the gap year that matters. And if a child decides to sit at home and spend time without being engaged, of course, when they apply, they may not be a very strong candidate. But if they work with the school or plan ahead for their gap year options and come up with a plan, sometimes I've had students come to my office saying, these are the things I'd like to do. I've had students, for example, one student of mine, she was super passionate about a particular band. So she decided, and she had the approval of her family, to go and be a roadie for that band. So for a year, all she did, she planned her year. I was very surprised because this was a very traditional Indian family, and they were super supportive. Right? I said, are you ready? And they were like, no, we've got it planned. She's got it planned, and I think we should give her the chance to do that. And she went ahead, did that, had a fabulous year. She met so many interesting people. It built her up as a young person. Because she was in charge, the family asked her to convince them as to why she should be allowed to do that. And so she came up with a very detailed plan of the entire year and how she was going to spend it. So in that case, the student was ready. Sometimes the family feels that the student is not ready. They might say, well, we'll either let them study in India or maybe go 4 hours away or 8 hours away. That's the max that we will allow them to leave our family. We think she's not ready or he's not ready yet, right? So those might be conversations you've encountered. I've had students, for example, who decided to take a gap year because one of the parents was ill, and he wanted to work with his father in the family business because the father was going through chemotherapy. And so this child and his older sister was already at university. And he said, let me be here and support my family for a year. And so he decided to do that. So he already had an offer from his uni, and we told the university well in advance, saying, look, we encouraged him, we supported him to reach out to the university and have that conversation while he was still in the school. Right? So that was another case study that I remember. I had another student who was developing an app, brilliant science and proper science, and a very, very focused, pointy kind of kid. And he wanted to take a year off to work and finesse his app. He was working with developers, and he also wanted to compete in the Intel Science Fair, where he had been shortlisted as a finalist. And so he took a gap year. He already had an offer from Harvey Mudd, and so he decided, we reached out, and he reached out to Tira. Tira was like, sure, let him do that, and then join us a year later. In fact, he took the IB exams afterwards, right? So he took a gap year and then did the IB exams. But you need to have a sense of how focused the child is, and whether their plan works based on you should know whether the child's going to just sit at home and be on their, just spend time, right? Or, so as a counselor, sometimes it's a very tricky sphere of influence walk that you have to manage. You want to advise, Frida's like, I bet you have plenty of stories. Maybe we could pass the mic and let people share. Not right now, maybe. But these are, like I had another student who wanted to write a book. So she worked with a publisher right here in Bombay. Another, for example, she wanted to work on a movie script. So she took time off, and she was already working in the film industry. And so she took that entire year. This was not a subject she was applying to college for or had an offer for. I had a student, for example, who was interested in physics, and he had an offer from Edinburgh to study physics, right? But he was passionate about Indian classical music. So he spent a year traveling to the different cities and visiting the different gharanas. So that's all he did, right? So he had like a budget of 500 rupees a day, and so he found places where he could stay. He came from a very privileged family, so he could have very easily got the resources and stayed in a very, very closeted space. But this child decided, let me stretch myself as a young person. And of course, as Sapna and even Dan mentioned, we have students sometimes from Singapore, South Korea, and Israel. for whom military service is part of their national requirement. So then you work with students so that you know they know that the school's there to support them when the time comes for them to apply. So, or some of them apply and then work with the colleges saying, these are my gap year plans and this is what I hope to do.
Before we move to Brandon's portion, I just wonder if both of you could just respond about when a child says, I'm interested in a gap year, what is the typical response from the parent?
It depends on how ready they feel the child is. So if the student has already displayed evidence that they are able to manage their own time and are independent, the family usually is convinced. They're able to convince their families. If the family feels they're not ready at all, then they might say, see, in the Indian context, how do you explain to your neighbors why your child's sitting at home for a year? Right? Even my kids who have offers from Australia, where they sometimes take a break and 6 months break, I'll have families sometimes ask me, how do I explain? Everybody will ask me why my son or daughter is sitting at home, right? So then you tell them, and then you connect them with other families whose children have done gap years, right? Or point them out to resources online for students who are considering gap years. There are plenty of resources online, right? And reach out to people like Dan and Brendan, right? So ask. Your best allies in this process are right around you, sitting in this room. Right?
For me, in my short practice, what I've seen is one. Yes, you have the kind of parents. Some of them will outright go and support, and that's good. But you also, I feel the other way. It's become a buzzword. Yeah. So now parents now come and say, ma'am, why don't we let him take a gap year? I'm like, and why are we taking the gap year? Yeah. So it's become like no, because if we take a gap year now, he'll get an Ivy League admission later. So, I mean, a gap year, so I have to do the other way, say that gap years will not ensure Ivy League admissions, you know. The work has to be done. Yeah. So it's becoming both ways. Or sometimes become a buzzword also.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes we'll have students who are not happy with their predicted grades. They'll come to our office and say, well, I'm not happy with the list of colleges that I can apply to right now, so I'm going to take my exams, score better, show people that I'm more than capable, and then with that score, after a gap year, I'm going to apply, right? So sometimes it's a tricky conversation that you have to. Or we might have students who come to you with the family and discuss gap year options after their July 6th results are out in the IB, right? So suddenly they say, well, you know, we are not happy, or we are super happy with the kind of scores this child's achieved. So now let's apply for bigger name schools than he already has. So then it's time for a conversation.
Oh, yes.
So when we mention the social challenges, especially when it comes to what the neighbors or the relatives will be talking about, another thing that we, at least in Gujarat, what we face is a lot of parents, especially like daughters, they have the concern of if they take a gap year or a couple of gap years, then what about the marriage?
It becomes later.
So that is another challenge that comes.
No, it's very true.
We're going to talk about that next. Yeah.
Just assure them they'll meet very nice young men or women or whoever, yeah, their partner preferences. Yeah.
I'm a parent who wants to follow a passion and took a gap year way back in '89. And I'm a parent who allowed my son to follow his passion and give him a gap year. So he got selected for a football academy club in Germany and he pursued his passion for a gap year.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have, I think it's good news that Indian parents are coming forward consciously.
Yeah, because see, we come from a context. We come from a context where, in at least my generation, it's assumed that after college or after high school, you go directly, or you fight hard to get a spot in university, and then after that, you need to get a job, and like it's very, very structured, and like so when you decide, hey, I'm going to take a moment to pause, it's an unknown thing. So it's working with the families on educating them about the possibilities that exist in a gap year, right? So when you work with the families, they'll actually sometimes be open and they might come up with their own brilliant plan, right? Or they might still go ahead and decide, nope, he's going right to college or she's going right to college. Even then, at least you've done your part, giving them choices, right? Thank you.
I have a question. The context here is a lot about education abroad. And then when you talk about gap years, it was about CLAT and exams for engineering. How do both your counselors advise students who want to take a gap year and want to study in India? Because a lot of universities in India do have a problem, and I think we have a lot of Indian counselors.
For many of those kids who take a gap year to appear for examinations, they're very clear. They're like, either we will get through IIT or then we will go abroad. So they have their backup options as this thing. So then they're not looking at the Indian universities other than the IIT or the CLAT or whatever. And the IITs and the CLATs don't mind. You can take 2 years as long as you're the right age. So it's okay. Then.
Students who don't want to do an engineering or CLAT.
There are none of those who want to, then they are the proper, authentic gap year students who want to do that and follow their passion. And I had one who wanted, because he's very good at cricket, so under 19, and he had a deadline to match, and he wanted to take a year off. So those kind of things happen, and that's a genuine thing. But I don't know, I think Ashoka and all would now accept gap year students, yeah. I think we should give it to Brandon now.
Just in the interest of time, we're going to transition to talking about gap years post-college. And I think that some of the questions and discussion that we've had so far has been relevant to what I'm going to discuss coming up, which is that, the term gap year is actually not the best term to use, in my opinion, because it gives students, but also parents, this idea that there's nothing intentional about it, that it's filling some sort of unknown gap. Right. But what I'm going to argue is that, because I don't come from your world, I'm not an admissions counselor, I'm not a recruitment person, I don't work at a high school, I oversee career development for our university where Dan works as well. And so we have a team of 14 full-time professional career coaches that are organized by industry. So if you're an engineering student or a fine arts student or a film student or a liberal arts major, you have your own dedicated career coach. Plus, we have 20 students that work in our office, 3 of which are graduate assistants. So we have about 5,000 career coaching appointments per year. And what we are really aiming for is to make sure that we have really clear outcomes. And so we are one of the only institutions in the United States that is really clear on our website about exactly what our students are doing when they graduate. And so we show data about the percent going into employment, the percent going into graduate school, the percent going into military service, and the percent going into gap year experiences, and those that are still seeking. In the US context, we are mandated to record postgraduate outcomes within 6 months of graduation. So, not every student has a job immediately when they graduate, but the goal is to make sure that either over the summer or early fall after they graduate in the spring, that they've really landed somewhere. And when it comes to gap year experiences, we want to make sure that they understand that gap year is a legitimate outcome. And it is a legitimate outcome, especially for those students who are on an educational path that requires more self-reflection and exploration. And we'll talk about why that's important within the US context in a minute. But we demonstrate on this website, the employers that our students are going to work for, the salaries that our students are making. And really what this is all about is to make sure that our parents, especially before they bring students to our campus, they understand that gap year is a legitimate outcome as well. So how do we do this? We look at the outcomes by schools and colleges. And so at LMU, we have 5 undergraduate colleges that are focused in a cluster of industry areas or disciplines. And so what you can see here are the percentage of students for the most recent graduating class where we have complete data, because if it's 6 months after graduation, we still don't know yet where the class of 2019 has landed. So what you can see here are some interesting trends. For liberal arts, we have a pretty high percentage of students going into employment, but it's actually one of the highest. It actually is the highest percent of gap year students. And we'll talk about maybe why that's the case. For our business students, it's almost nothing. It's 1% going into gap year after they graduate. For our fine arts students, which includes everything from music to dance to studio arts, 5%. And for our STEM engineering fields, 8%. And then for our film and television program, based in Los Angeles, of course, fewer than 1% of students are going into gap year. So the theories behind this for each of these populations include, for instance, if we start with film and television, our students are trained to go right into industry. So because their coursework is aligned with Paramount Pictures and Netflix and a lot of the studios in Los Angeles, those students are already working in internships and working at employers where gap year is just not even on their radar screen. And I think in many cases it would seem like a failure for many of those students to do a gap year because all of their training has been very applied. It happens, but not very often. If we look at the STEM fields, in my office, in addition to the industry career coaches, we have a pre-health career coach. And the pre-health career coach is really designed to help students discern whether medical school is the right profession for them. I used to joke that 100% of incoming students to our university were pre-med, and by the time they graduate, about 20% are pre-med. The reality is that students come into many US universities thinking medicine, but they don't realize that there's about 20 other healthcare professions that they can go into. And so the gap year is really helpful for those students because many times they need to take another year's worth of coursework, or they need to volunteer, or they need to have an international experience that prepares them to pass the examinations for medical school. So that's why we see a high percentage for our STEM, which includes science students. Our fine arts students, I would argue, are often those students that have really focused on their craft, right? They've gotten really good at dance or music or theater, and by the time they get to their senior year, they realize, I actually don't know how to sell my skills, right? So I might need another year of thinking about, adding some professional experience, thinking about opening a studio or a gallery so that their work and their craft can be known. That is also a legitimate gap year experience. Business students want a job very similar to our film and television students. And then for liberal arts, many of those students are really focused on service, focused on faith, spirituality, mindfulness. And so many of those students are thinking about, how can I give back to the world in front of me? And I think those are really interesting ways to think about it. So at LMU, we have, again, this career and professional development office. And if we think about the structure of US education, it's very formulaic in some ways, right? So you've got your first year, sophomore, junior, and senior year. Within our own website, we reinforce the stereotype in some ways that you're going to get what you need in each of these years so that by the time you graduate, you're prepared for the working world or for graduate school. We know because of students' experiences that that's not exactly the way it works. And so one of the challenges with this is that students at all of our universities and institutions don't necessarily mature at the same rate. They don't necessarily accomplish or achieve at the same rate. And most importantly, they may not have figured out what it is that they want to do right after graduation by the time they finish. One of the things that's been interesting to be at this conference as kind of an outsider, someone who doesn't work in the admissions space, is to hear the language around what's important around career counseling and development. What I've picked up on in the past couple of days is that there's a lot of focus on doing what you love, doing what makes you happy. And I can tell you that in the United States, in our context, that's actually not enough, because we also need to know what the world needs from us and what kinds of things are driving students to be able to join some of these organizations and employers. So for many of our students, and I'll talk about some sample programs, they need to get off campus. They need to think about, what are the big problems that need solving, and where do my skills and my happiness and passion actually meet some of those big problems. And so thinking about those grand issues like climate change, like immigration, like our disconnectedness as humans, there are ways that gap years can address that. So some of the components of more structured gap year programs that our students are aiming for include focus on that service or social justice aspect. Dan mentioned this a little bit, but Loyola Marymount University, named after St. Ignatius of Loyola, is a Jesuit Catholic school. And so many of our students are coming from a Catholic background or coming from a faith or spirituality background, but many of them are not. And so as they experience their LMU education, they are turned on to service, turned on to the needs of the most marginalized in our society, and many of them want to go out and do more work in that area when they graduate. Simple living is also a component. If you've heard of Jesuit Volunteer Corps or even Peace Corps or Lutheran Volunteer Corps, many of the faith-based volunteer programs, the goal is to actually not make very much money at all. And so we talked about the parental pressures on the secondary level. There's similar pressures on postgraduate, because if you're paying a private education in the US or anywhere, to then justify a year's worth of not making any money is a tough sell, right? And especially if you're going to stay in the country that you are attending, where there might be visa implications that you might use up OPT and things like that. So that becomes a little bit of a challenge. Community building, many of these programs are structured in the way that the students live together, and they're actually focused on cooking meals for one another, doing household chores, those kinds of things. Faith and spirituality, personal growth, and most importantly, from my perspective, professional development. So one of the things I'm not going to show you, but maybe just tell you, is that for many of the students in the United States that do gap year programs that are structured, like Peace Corps, volunteer programs, they come out with even better outcomes after that experience. They're going to work for consulting firms, they're going to work for banks, big tech companies like Google, Facebook, Tesla, these kinds of places. So it can be a great way to extend the discernment process for students and to show for students that have not done any volunteering or anything other than coursework that they've given back to their communities a little bit more. Some of the postgraduate or post-college opportunities within Gap Year include things that emanate from those components. And so to highlight a few of these, community organizing, agriculture, working with individuals with disabilities, advocacy, business administration, social services, pretty standard things that you might expect. One of the critiques of Gap Year programs is that for students who are choosing to do a Gap Year and are thinking about that as a launching pad to something in the corporate world, the critique is that by only spending a year focused on the most marginalized in our communities, you're kind of checking a box, right? You're saying, I care about this year, and then after I'm done caring about this, I'm going to go work for a big corporation and make a lot of money. That's a legitimate criticism, and I think what we can expect of our students is that they at least go through that experience having reflected on those issues and think about how they can make more ethical decisions within corporations, within big companies, big organizations. But the goal is to also make sure they consider wholeheartedly a career path that might embrace working in a nonprofit, working in a social justice organization as well. And then just to leave a little bit of data here with you, this happens to be just for Loyola Marymount University graduates, but we have 2 programs at our institution that are created within our own organization. So Place Corps is a program where our students go work for school districts, public schools, private schools within the Los Angeles area, and they actually get a master's degree program out of this program. So at the same time that they're volunteering and teaching, they're getting a degree out of that. The same is true for a lot of the Teach for America programs, which allow students to work in a public school district that is typically underserved and serving usually minorities within the US. And many of those programs are attached to master's degrees. And so what we've discovered in the US context is that students find Gap Year experiences more valuable if they can get a credential at the same time that they're pursuing that. For the others, Peace Corps, Jesuit Volunteer Corps, City Year, Ignatian Service Corps, and others, these are all the things that you heard about at the secondary level that have application for graduate. So it can be anything from needing to care for ill parents or family members to very structured programs where students are going abroad and serving communities there. And so I think the kind of long story short for professional development and career services is that we want to think about Gap Year in a slightly different way. It's not Plan B. It's not necessarily students don't know what they want to do, but we count it as the outcomes of the 99% of our students having a positive outcome within 6 months of graduation as a legitimate outcome. And I would say that we should think about a different term, right? So if there's ways to kind of redefine it or even think about new terminology, I think that would actually benefit a lot of the conversation that we have on our campuses. Yes?
So are some of these options that you suggested, are they open for international students or are they only for Americans?
Many of them are open for international students. I believe that Peace Corps is not, and I believe also that Teach for America may not be as well. But I don't know about Teach for America, actually. But the others are. So I know Jesuit Volunteer Corps, City Year, Ignatian Service Corps, and for instance, I'm on the board of Lutheran Volunteer Corps, and that's open to international students as well. Go ahead. So the way it works for those kinds of service organizations is that they're employed by the service organization and they're working in the community in different cities throughout the United States for local nonprofits. So they might be embedded within a local organization doing work there. And so it tends to count as their OPT as just a legitimate employment situation for the students. This is after college. This is after college. Yeah. This is after college. Yeah. Great questions. We're going to open it up to questions for anyone in the panel now. So if you've got questions for Annie or Sapna or Dan as well. Yes?
This question is an offshoot of the session we attended yesterday by University of California, which said that if somebody takes a gap year, then they cannot do their SAT or ACT. That will not be acceptable. Is it true for your institutions as well?
So it's not true for our institution, and that just goes to reinforce that. So it is important to realize that if you are exploring universities in the United States, there are 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States. And what would be wonderful is if we all sat in a room together, right, and talked about how we really want to make things easier for everybody else. So we'll ask for the exact same things, we'll have the same policies, everything. We'll ask for everything at the same deadline. Wouldn't that be wonderful? That'd be really great, right? We don't do that. We don't do that. So it's really important to reinforce the idea that each institution is unique. I know the University of California system is unique in that they will not let a student submit a SAT score that they take after they graduate, and in attempting to avoid the circumstance where a student only focuses on a specific test, focusing on that particular individual test for that year. At LMU specifically, we actually do not require the SAT or ACT from international applicants, so we're at a different part of the spectrum altogether, really. But again, it's going to vary from place to place.
So the ideal thing is for the student to write and the counselor to write the institution and apply.
So when a student decides on an institution, and if that would be the point when I would follow up with the institution about the gap year specifically, if that's something they want to do. Not necessarily with every single place before they're serious about it, but if they're really very interested in attending an institution and then but want to take a gap year before actually enrolling, that's when I would follow up with them about their policies. Sir.
I have a question. Is there any data for the number of international students coming to the U.S. to take a gap year prior to enrollment, and then also post-graduation? Is there any data? I've never come across it.
I've not specifically found information like that either. Yeah, I would imagine maybe IE would have something along those lines, but I've not seen anything specifically myself. That's a great question. That would be a great source of information as well. Yes.
So you've used the word career coach, and certainly I've heard several individuals in your position at U.S. universities use that terminology.
Sure.
And it's usually because they've attended with a group of universities that are trying to be more avant-garde, more responsive to the workplace. Where did, in your organization, like when did you decide to either change your name from career placement to professional development? And who do you rely on for your inspiration? Because I think that your school does a tremendous job in that position.
Thank you. Yeah, terminology matters a lot to me, and it's something that I changed as soon as I got to LMU because I knew that for our population, the word counseling for what we do was going to be a turnoff, specifically around career. It's different in every institution. For us, it was. There's a really interesting article that was written, I think, around 2012, 2013, called the kind of the future of career services by Farouk Aday, who was at Stanford at the time, is now the vice provost for life design at Johns Hopkins University, and then at the time, Christine Cruz Vergara, who's at Wellesley College, reporting directly to the president in a role similar to mine, and now she's at a company called Handshake, which has job kind of postings for U.S. citizens who are looking for jobs in the United States right now. They wrote this article and they showed the kind of evolution of career services over the past few decades. And what we saw in the 80s and 90s is a kind of a redefinition of the work that we do, going from more kind of psychometric and psychology-based counseling methods to more coaching methods. And part of the reason for that shift in the US especially was that the landscape around job placement was changing. It was not just about, do I have the degree and do I have the skills and do I get the job? Now it's a little bit more about the student meeting us where we are. So the primary reason we use the word coach on our campus is that I hire my career coach or coaching staff, not from education necessarily, and not from other universities, but from industry. I want our students who meet with our career coach to know and have confidence in those individuals that they have actually talked to employers and know what employers want and can have the legitimacy with employers, and then can go turn around to the student and say, here's what I know about this area. So about half of my staff come from a more traditional counseling background. They got the master's degree in education. They've got some counseling kind of hours behind them. The other half are coming from industry. The final thing I'll say about the word coaching is that it has inherent implications for the students being a part of the equation. There can be a misperception with the word counseling in our context within career coaching, that if students hear counseling, then they're being diagnosed or they're being told what they need to be doing in terms of career path, or that there's something wrong with them. And I know that because we all come from the counseling background, we know that those are just stereotypes about the field in general, but we don't typically have the kind of embedded structures within career development to require students to meet with us. So anything that creates a barrier to them accessing our services, we try to think about either redefining or thinking about new terminology. So I would say that probably half or slightly more than half of career centers in the United States use the word coaching now. By the way, master's degrees in university higher education in general many of them have gotten rid of their career counseling coursework and their certification. So there's fewer people coming out of those programs as well. Great question.
I know it works well to have a context for a gap year, but there will be instances where students are purely confused or clueless or indecisive, and sometimes they may not declare the reason, which could have something to do with either home finances or even self-care needs.
Anything, yeah.
So as counselors, how do we empower or support these kids?
I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the reasons I put there for the ranking. Not having enough funds or wanting to raise funds or or being confused, not being sure of what they want to do. At least in the data that we got, that those two were the lowest ranked, so the least common reasons given or even valid reasons cited by the counselors, which is unfortunate. But I would imagine that should be actually a very, very valid reason for taking a gap year. And I mean, you would support a student like that in whatever way you could.
In fact, I remember very clearly back when, you remember, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, the Dubai real estate market crashed. So back then I was working with a particular student whose mother had planned on selling the flat and using that to finance the child's education. And they realized they didn't have the necessary money, right? So sometimes it's also, the child's grieving because they're not able to do that and out of reasons that are totally out of control. And the family also feels guilty that they're not able to support her in what she wants to do, right? So sometimes it's working with the families as such. Plenty of families that I've worked with, for example, because of a downturn that their family business had, they may not be able to afford a child's education, or they might have younger siblings, and because they might have planned, hey, we can do that, but maybe they realize they actually haven't planned well and haven't calculated the actual cost of attendance. So work early with your families. Make sure they have if they're planning on selling property, make sure they do it by year 11, right? So that they have cash in hand. No, I'm speaking from experience, right? Because otherwise it'll be like a fire sale. They won't get good price on their property if they're doing a rush sale. So, or if they're planning on taking a bank loan, make sure, encourage them, hey, if this is a concern, start working early, have your finances in order.